Hello, Internet family. This is Anjanette Potter, also known as Adam's Rib, and you are listening to the Smart Black Girls Club podcast. So, for this episode, I'm going to discuss the Cleopatra race controversy. So, for those of you who don't know, let me go ahead and get into this. So, Jada Pinkett Smith decided to executive produce a docu-series called African Queens, and she is wanting an audience to get to learn about the fearless, captivating lives of queens who were likely not part of their Western academic curriculum. So the information that I'm giving you is courtesy of the Tadum website, which is part of Netflix. So the latest installment features one of history's most famous, powerful, and misunderstood women, Queen Cleopatra. Throughout her life, though her life has been the subject of much debate and lore, the new series hopes to reassess this part of her fascinating story, including her love life, in a brand new way, and also highlight one of her strongest weapons, her intellect. So the second season of the documentary series recreates the true story of Queen Cleopatra, and it's narrated by Pinkett Smith, who wanted to find stories to inspire her daughter Willow. The first season of African Queens followed 17th century warrior Queen Ninja, I'm gonna have to look at this, who ruled over Ndongo and Matamba, which were located in what's known today as Angola. So her reason for doing this, which I think is very noble, we don't get to hear stories about African queens, because usually anymore when you talk about royals, we're usually talking about Europe. We just recently had the coronation of King Charles. He is now King Charles, and for the past week, of course, we had to listen to what everybody was wearing. One of the things I will say, the only competition to the Brits in that hat game is the Africans, the Ethiopians. The sisters bring it too with the head wraps. So every culture seems to have a way for their women to sport the headwear at formal occasions. And so, like I said, I remember watching Prince William's wedding to William and Kate, and watching. I remember when their mother got married, and I remember, I wound up, for whatever reason, I wound up early that morning and watched their parents get married, and saw the whole thing, and it's just interesting to watch those ceremonies and see all of that. So I think it's interesting. I applaud Jada Pinkett Smith for wanting to tell those stories, because if you're a person of color, especially African American in this country, you may think that you only descended from slaves. Now keep in mind that many of the people who were sold over here possibly would have been slaves over there also. So the whole whether or not we actually descended from kings and queens is, a matter of discussion as well, because we're also talking about tribes. I've been following quite a few African commentators, and I always tend to think of them as us, 1.0, before slavery kicked in, and they've had their share of problems with colonization as well. So wanting to go back and say, hey, the kings and queens are not only amongst the English, the British, the French, the Irish, and every other European country. There are kings and queens of African descent as well. And so I can remember for years there has been debate over Cleopatra's racial background, her ethnic background, as to whether or not she was considered to be a black queen or not. And so I understand her wanting to do this because you don't see it. We don't see the representation as much. And so she's saying that was really important for her as well as for her daughter and just for her community to be able to know these stories because there are tons of them. So in the series, Queen Cleopatra is portrayed by Adele James. The creative choice to cast an actor of mixed heritage to play Cleopatra is a nod to the century-long conversation about her race. Over the time of her reign, Egypt's popularity was multicultural and multiracial. Cleopatra's race was unlikely to be documented, and the identities of her mother and paternal grandparents weren't known. Some speculate that she was a native Egyptian woman, while others say she was Greek. Now that's the website and their information. So I want to delve a little bit into Miss Jada Pinkett being sued. Okay, because see if there's information there. Okay, Egyptian lawyer sues Netflix for blackwashing history. An Egyptian lawyer is suing Netflix for depicting Cleopatra as black in upcoming documentary Queen Cleopatra. So once again, this is a four parts series. Executive produced by Jada Pinkett Smith. Now, for those of you who don't know, she and her husband Will Smith have been responsible for quite a few shows. They did All of Us with Lisa Ray, and what is her name? Tisha Campbell's ex-husband, Dwayne Martin. Which was a very good show. I would have liked to see more. One of the things that I liked about that lineup, I think that they were in I think they might have been WP or UPN. I think UPN possibly. They had some really good quality shows. I liked the black representation, that we, were successful, in our professions and different little stuff like that. Well, not little, but different stuff like that. I liked the fact that, different shows like that were really encouraging a lot of our young people that they could literally be anything that they wanted to be. I kind of fell off with CW. When they made UPN CW, I fell off. Because their best shows got canceled. In fact, about the only decent show that they kept was Girlfriends, and it wound up getting the axe. And so it was horrible. Like, and you have now all these white shows, which I don't even watch. I think the only one that I wound up watching was Gossip Girl, and I fell off of that one. I watched Seventh Heaven, which I was watching before they changed hands. But now you don't hardly see no black people on CW, so I don't even watch. Because if I could watch any of the other networks and see a largely white cast with maybe a speckle of color here or there, which is what I feel like I get when I look at network television. So, So her series explores the heritage of Egyptian's last pharaoh. She was a pharaoh who reigned for 21 years between 51 to 30 BC before her death by suicide. And so it's supposed to focus on her heritage, which has been the subject of academic debate and often ignored by Hollywood. Because the most famous portrayal of Cleopatra was Elizabeth Taylor back in the day, and that's where a lot of people felt like it was whitewashed. So now a lawyer named Mahmoud Al-Samri has filed a lawsuit over the casting and claimed that Netflix has committed a crime for portraying Cleopatra as black. The complaint states, according to Egyptian Independent, most of what Netflix platform displays do not conform to Islamic and societal values, and especially Egyptian ones. So Al-Samri claims that the trailer contradicted Egyptian history and promoted Afrocentrism at the expense of Egyptian identity. His complaint continues: in order to preserve the Egyptian national and cultural identity amongst Egyptians all over the world, there must be pride in the making of such work. Sally Ann Ashton, an expert who appears in the documentary, previously spoke to Netflix Tadam website, who I just read about Cleopatra's lineage. She said Cleopatra ruled in Egypt long before the Arab settlement in North Africa. If the maternal side of her family were indigenous women, they would have been African, and this should be reflected in contemporary representations of her. So I'm going to delve a little bit, because my thing with some of that is many times there are the most famous person of Greek lineage that I think about was one of my 80s crushes, George Michael. So George Michael, was British, but he was also of Greek lineage. So if you look at him, you can tell that he is not completely white. Now, I personally believe that there was a lot of crossover during that time period. Because if you look on your map, Greece is not that far from Africa. They're about a hop, skip, and a jump from each other. So I'm going to delve into the controversy. So this is Cleopatra the Seventh. So she was not the first ruler named Cleopatra. Excuse me. She was the last active Hellenistic ruler of the Macedonian-led Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, which has caused debate in some circles. There's a general consensus amongst scholars that she was predominantly of Macedonian Greek ancestry and minorly of Iranian descent. Sogdian, and Persian. Others, including some scholars and laymen, have wondered whether she may have had additional ancestries. So, for example, the article was Cleopatra Black was published in Ebony in 2002. Mary Lefkowitz, Professor Emerita of Classical Studies at Wesley College, traces the main origins of the Black Cleopatra claim to the 1946 book by J.A. Rogers called World's Great Men of Color, although noting the idea of Cleopatra as black goes back at least to the 19th century. So Lefkowitz refutes his hypothesis on various scholarly grounds. The Black Cleopatra claim was further revived in an essay by Afrocentrist author John Henry Clark. So, if you're wondering what Afrocentrism is, Afrocentrism is an approach to the study of world history that focuses on the history of people of recent African descent. It is in some respects a response to Eurocentric attitudes about African people and their historical contributions. It seeks to counter what it sees as mistakes and ideas perpetrated by the racist philosophical underpinnings of Western academic disciplines as they developed during and since Europe's early Renaissance, as justifying rationales for the enslavement of other peoples in order to enable more accurate accounts of not only African but all people's contributions to world history. Afrocentricity deals primarily with self-determination and African agency and is a Pan-African point of view for the study of culture. So Pan-Africanism is a worldwide movement that seems to encourage and strengthen bonds of solidarity between all indigenous and diasporas of African ancestry, based on a common goal dating back to the Atlantic slave trade. The movement extends beyond continental Africans with a substantial support base amongst the African diaspora in the Americas and Europe. Pan-Africanism can be said to have its origins in the struggle of the African people against enslavement and colonization. And this struggle may be traced back to the first resistance on slave ships, rebellions, and suicides. Through the constant plantation and colonial uprisings and the Back to Africa movements of the 19th century. So I watched a movie last night, what they call a Black Renaissance, classic. Because all black movies of the 70s do not fit under the umbrella of blaxploitation. So the movie was Cotton Comes to Harlem. And in Cotton Comes to Harlem, there's a preacher, and his hustle is the Black to Africa movement. Back to Africa. But Black to Africa would be an appropriate name for it too. So the Back to Africa movement was a movement that was started by Marcus Garvey, and there's controversies there. I think a lot of the great leaders that tried to do something good for the people, some of them didn't have the nicest love lives, because unfortunately, along with a lot of these movements took place in an era in our country where a lot of misogynistic attitudes toward women were also present. I can remember us studying Freud in psychology. So Freud is the godfather of what they call the talking cure, which one of my blogs is named after. And the talking cure, we see it now where the client comes in, they sit down and they talk about whatever brings them to the therapist's office. And so the talking, Freud found that when people got the ability to talk about their problems, that they felt better, and they were able to talk, when they're able to talk to a third person that isn't a part of their church, isn't a part of their family, doesn't have any inherent biases toward them, they were able to arrive at some pretty successful solutions on what to do about their life. And, one of the conclusions we came to about Freud, because, people have opinions about Freud. Freud was responsible for, what they call Oedipus or Electra syndrome, and different names for different, behaviors. He was also a product of the environment that he was raised in, because he was, I think, Austria, which is in Germany, and the upper and it moved amongst the upper class circles. So he saw a lot of women who had maids, like the women just really, husbands that were providers, but didn't really take them seriously. They were often threatened with being put in institutions if they didn't behave right. There was just a lot of classism and just a lot of upper crust mess going on with a lot of these women. So, and I believe the same thing about some of the stuff that you hear people saying about some of the civil rights or early leaders of major black movements. They weren't without their controversy, because, there were a lot of sexist attitudes toward, women. That's one of the reasons why, as black women, we go through the whole thing of, we not only have to deal with the oppression that comes with being black, we also have to deal with sexist, deal with men who have very sexist notions about women. And sometimes those sexist notions become teachings in our church, which is even really messed up. Let's see here. So we came back. We left off at John Henry Clark. So Mr. Clark was the head of African history at Hunter College. And let me see here. So there was a writing entitled African Warrior Queens. So Lefkowitz notes that the essay includes the claim that Cleopatra described herself as black in the New Testament's book of Acts. So let me see here. So Acts in the Bible indicates acts of the apostles. So this is when the apostles first received the Holy Spirit and began to move about doing the greater works that Jesus said that they would do, because he told them, greater works than I'm doing right now will you do. And he was talking about, the acts that they would do after he went through the crucifixion, after he rose out of the grave, and after he ascended to heaven. And so, in fact, Cleopatra had died more than 60 years before the death of Jesus Christ. Yeah, I don't remember her being mentioned in that book. Some early 20th century scholars speculated that she was in part Jewish, but this hypothesis didn't last into later 20th century historiography. Scholars have generally identified Cleopatra as essentially of Greek ancestry, with some Persian and Sogdian Iranian ancestry, based on the fact that her Macedonian Greek family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had intermarried with the Seleucid dynasty. So now the Seleucid dynasty, forgive my pronunciation, was a Macedonian Greek family founded by Seleucus I Nicator, which ruled in the. So they were centered in the Near East and regions of the Asian part of the earlier Persian Empire during the Hellenistic period. My thing with all of this is, so her official coinage, which she would have approved, and the 3 portrait busts of her considered to be authentic by scholars, which match her coin, portray her as a Greek woman in style, although the Churchill bust is now largely considered by scholars to be that of her daughter, Cleopatra Selene II. Francisco Pina Polo writes that her coinage represents her image with certainty and asserts that the sculpted portrait of the Berlin Cleopatra is confirmed as having a similar profile. So, if this is her daughter, if the one portrait of her is considered to be her daughter, would it be too unreasonable to think that maybe she, like a lot of women of color during that time period, when she made this daughter, she made her with a man of Europe that had more Eurocentric features. So it could be why the daughter looks more European. Okay, because very few women of color at that time. I remember, and I've been talking about this. I'm going to do a commentary on the movie Chevalier. Chevalier was the product of a slave woman and a man of European or Caucasian descent, which means he's white. Most biracial or most light-skinned people during the time period of Chevalier would have had white fathers, because even though there were white women who dipped in the color pool, their offspring, if they were really, really upper crust or wealthy, their offspring were very seldom allowed to live. So it's every possibility that the daughter looks more European because she didn't have a black daddy. She didn't have a dad. Her biological father wasn't of color. So in 2009, a BBC documentary speculated that she might have been part North African. This was based largely on the examination of a headless skeleton of a female child in a 20 BCE tomb in Ephesus, modern Turkey. Ephesus is mentioned in the Bible as the book of Ephesians, the letter to the Ephesus church. Now, together with the old notes and photographs of the now missing skull, the remains were hypothesized to be those of Arsinoe IV, half-sister to Cleopatra, and conjecture based on discredited processes suggests that the remains belong to a girl whose race may have been North African. This claim is rejected by scholars, of course, based on the remains being impossible to identify as Arsinoe. The race of the remains seems impossible to identify at all. The fact that the remains belong to a child younger than Arsinoe when she died, and the fact that Arsinoe and Cleopatra shared the same father, but may have had different mothers. Your half-sister pretty much means that one of your parents don't match. So to me, I find these arguments interesting, especially when you consider the fact that this is only happening because she's being portrayed by a woman who is black. Now, I don't know if the young actress portraying her is 100% black, but where was all of this when Elizabeth Taylor was portraying this character? And I'm starting to see a pattern. When Halle Bailey was picked to be the Little Mermaid, never mind, Little Mermaid is a fictional character, you had all these people up in arms at the fact that Ariel was being portrayed by a black woman, as though a black woman, even though Halle Bailey can sing her behind off and sing circles around many of her critics, and it would take somebody who has some vocals to be able to play this part. You still have people who had a problem and not my Ariel, at the thought of her playing the part of Ariel. And it's like, many of the early Greeks were not of European descent. Many of the early Greeks were black. There were people, or at least people of color. I remember watching the Boondocks where they had Huey quoting that many of the people that were around at the time of Christ were people of color. They weren't white. But because we live in America and pretty much everything in Hollywood is Eurocentrized, and we have all of these, people who are playing these parts that are of European descent or Caucasian or white. Every time a black person gets greenlit to play a part that traditionally would have went to a white person, you have people who are up in arms. I would love to see what this guy looks like that's suing Jada Pinkett Smith. Because I'm like, why are you so up in arms? There's a possibility, and one of the reasons they say of mixed heritage, because during certain time periods, you had people who dipped, especially men and especially white men, who dipped with women of color and made babies. And some of them, like the story of Chevalier, some of them were able to get a hold to their children and bring them up through the ranks because they had the power to. They had the power to bring them out of and decide they did not want them to be raised as slaves, that they wanted to have them be elevated and serve in different stations. So, and like I said before, just because she was Greek, all Greeks are not white. Many Greeks are people of color. I can remember hearing people talk about being Italian and having hair as curly as mine is. Okay, because of the mixture between Italians and Africans over there. So in that part of the country, there likely may have been a lot of mixing going on. So saying she's Macedonian or Greek does not mean she was white. It's something to take into consideration, but I think it's I find it interesting. Let me see here. Ancient Egyptian rapes controversy. So let's click on here. So the question of the race of ancient Egyptians was raised historically as a product of the early racial concepts of the 18th and 19th century and was linked to models of racial hierarchy. And I plan to do a podcast on this. So racial hierarchy is a system of stratification that is based on the belief that some racial groups are superior to other racial groups at various points or perceived to be. Let me inject that in there. So myself and many of the content creators that I have followed talk about the whole issue of the perception of racial hierarchy. So in the United States, if you were to say that there is a racial hierarchy when it comes to power and the ability to get wealth. So white males are typically at the top. Then you have white women. Then you have men of color or black men. And then you have women of color or black women, which occupies almost the bottoms. Now, this is, like I said, this is perceived. This does not necessarily mean that that is the way it is and we should go along with it. If anything, seeing that this is a thing ought to make you want to fight harder to dismantle some of those mindsets. Because, if you're at the quote so-called bottom of the barrel, and not all black men think this way, and really not all white men think this way, not all everybody thinks this way, but the way things have played out, because women are typically thought of as having less power than men, although that's been changing. And I think the fact that it was changing led a lot of men to vote for Donald Trump. It's the reason that we have what they call the manosphere. I've already told people, do not, on my personal social media, don't come to me with no men's rights stuff. Well, men's rights are the result of blah, blah, blah. The reason why I don't really get down with a whole lot of men's rights stuff is because it's really not a reaction to the unfairness of feminism. It is the response to women being able to have any type of equality at all. And it can also be a reaction to black people not wanting to be under the thumb of white oppression or white supremacy. Here recently, some of the fallouts that I've been having and fights that I've been having even within the black community, I've said I think that white supremacy, and notice I said white supremacy and not necessarily white people, have done such a good job at brainwashing black people into believing that we don't have a right to occupy certain spaces, that we don't have a right to a certain level of education, that we don't have a right to equal rights to live where we want and basically do what we want. That has been such a head job and has done such a good job of brainwashing us that now we're starting to do it to each other. And us doing that to each other is resulting in what you call respectability politics. Now, I think I did an earlier podcast or blog about respectability politics, or at least intersectionality. I know during one of my 29 days of black feminism, I mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw, who is responsible for the term intersectionality. But I honestly believe that centuries of brainwashing, centuries of hearing, stuff like that's not a realistic job for you. That's not a realistic profession for you to go into. I recently saw a white man on TikTok talk about, there was a clip celebrating black doctors of both genders, women and men, and instead of celebrating with the people and being glad that they were graduating, because med school, I'm sure, is not easy, this man decided to discredit them by saying, would you be happy to go knowing certain, in other words, he was inferring that these doctors were not going to be as qualified as a white doctor because they're not accusing them of not receiving the same level of education and possibly having certain things about their information padded so that they would be able to pass their state's test to get their medical license and be able to practice medicine. And I said, you couldn't just be happy for them that they went through the rigors of med school and are now graduating and going to get licensed. And now we have a few more doctors in the world, and a few more black doctors, because black women in pregnancy and OBGYN issues have been an issue for a while now. We're not getting the same care. And when I say we're not getting the same care, not only are we not getting the same empathy, which is also a form of care, we are not being taken seriously when we complain about pain. We're not being taken seriously when we talk about issues that we're knowing about our bodies. These are serious issues. And many times they come out of old racial stereotypes about black women in pain, or black women and lazy, or black women and just complaining to be complaining. Like, I think that every time a patient comes to you, that you should take them seriously. Just like mental health. We learned about culturally bound disorders, which can be a thing because maybe your culture supports a certain belief system that may not be that would be considered to be a mental disorder in everyday life. And so have the knowledge of a person's cultural background really helps in being able to treat that person. Well, if you've got people who view your background as weird and don't sympathize with what you're going through, and the guy, posted this, and of course, as black people, we came to the defense and said, yes, I would be more than happy. I've had doctors every color. My current doctor is a Indian woman, a woman of color, and so I'm very happy. Like I said, have most of them been white males? Yeah, but they've been pretty much across the board. Okay? They've been pretty much across the board. I'm one of those people, as long as the care that I'm getting is good quality care, then I don't really care what color they are. I do like the fact that I feel like I have somebody that I can reach, because of the Ohio Health app, which I, support wholeheartedly. We now have ways to get in touch with our physician that we don't always got to go to their office. We can talk to them on the phone. We can do face-to-face through the phone. I tend to like going in sometimes because, there's some stuff that people can't take care of over the phone. But we do have a crisis. And the thing of it is, well, what does this have to do with Cleopatra? It has everything to do with it. Okay? It's funny that whenever the representation is white, I never hear nobody saying anything. But as soon as as you decide to cast a person, I don't have any problem with Jada Pinkett Smith casting this woman as being black, or at least being, of mixed race heritage, because it, whether we like it or not, people who are different races do get together and do have sex and do make babies. And so being able, to accurately, even if they're saying that she was of Greek descent, that still doesn't mean she was white. I've known some Greeks when I grew up, and they just like every other ethnicity, they're every color. They're all different types of colors. We have Greek restaurants here. Now, the majority, of course, in the United States, because of whitewashing and, racial mixing, most Greeks look European. But they're still not necessarily white. So just because you say she was Greek and Macedonian and this, that, and the other, that doesn't necessarily mean she was white. Okay, it doesn't completely rule out that she still may have been of African heritage. I think some people are so used to that Eurocentralized standard of beauty and standard of royalty or whatever, that they just don't want to let go of that top spot, of what they perceive to be the top spot. So when they talk about racial hierarchy, I have to throw perceived in there, because occupying the top spots or top tiers or whatever does not make a person better than you, because you're really talking about the whole concept of power. Racial power, especially political power. Different concepts of power, because you're the most catered to group. It also is one of the reasons why this whole recent controversy over not only Cleopatra, but the whole Ebony Williams thing has been a thing, because you have a lot of black women who are tired of being treated like they're bottom of the barrel, because they're not. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, we're all human and we're all valued the same by God. Okay? But when you're talking about people and their little stratifications or whatever, then you have to deal with people who value certain groups more than they do others. And it's horrible. So a variety of views circulated about the racial identity of the Egyptians and the source of their culture. Some scholars argue that ancient Egyptian culture was influenced by other Afro-Asiatic speaking populations in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, or the Middle East, while others pointed to influences from various Nubian groups or populations in Europe. In many recent times, some writers continued to challenge the mainstream view, some focusing on the question of the race of specific notable individuals, such as the king represented in the Great Sphinx of Giza, native Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, or King Tut, as he is commonly known, Egyptian Queen Tai, and Greek Ptolemaic Queen Cleopatra the Seventh. So I went into this. This was what ancient Greek, ancient Egyptian. So when I was going into, I was like, well, let me, because like I said before, there very well may have been a lot of crossover during that time period. So I'm not going to rule out her having possible African ancestry, even though people even though people are saying that she is Macedonian Greek. It doesn't, for me, completely rule out that there could have been an African or two in there. Okay? But like I said before, so present day controversies. Today, the issues regarding the race of the ancient Egyptians are troubled waters, which most people who write about ancient Egypt from within the mainstream of scholarship avoid. The debate, however, takes place mainly in the public sphere and tends to focus on a small number of specific issues. Okay, and most of these issues are, so the first one they come up with, and if you want to look all this up for yourself, it is found under Wikipedia, under the title Ancient Egyptian Race Controversy. So let me see here. Present day controversies. Several scholars, including Diop, have claimed that King Tut, because that's too much for me to pronounce, was black, and have protested and attempted to reconstruct His facial features, as depicted in the cover of National Geographic, and they have represented that the king was too white on that cover. So let's get to, because I'm not going to read this whole thing. Okay. Of course, there's Cleopatra, who we're now talking about, and the whole controversy there. By the way, not all black people have black flat noses. Our noses are shaped all kinds of different ways. The Great Sphinx of Giza, the identity of the model for the Great Sphinx is unknown. Most experts believe that the face of the Sphinx represents the likeness of the pharaoh Khafra, although a few Egyptologists and interested amateurs have proposed different hypotheses. And once again, the debate is over whether or not they're black. Is anybody seeing a pattern but me? So another controversy is Kemet. Ancient Egyptians referred to their homeland as Kemet, conventionally pronounced Kemet, Kemet. According to Kai Anta Diop, the Egyptians refer to themselves as black. So once again, we have another controversy about the color, and the source of the controversy is that the individuals may be black. So like I said, I'm starting to see a pattern that whenever it's something that has to do with whether or not someone may be black, all of a sudden there's an uproar, or you have people who want to have a fit, and well, there's no way they could be black. Well, they're from this or that, the other black background. Well, that doesn't mean they weren't black. They're, like I was trying to find evidence that many of the early Greeks that could have possibly been of African descent. Just like many dark Italians, if you go to like Florence or go to Italy, you may find Italians that are very dark complected and have very, very curly hair, almost to the point where I would say it isn't what they would call 4C, which is supposed to be the coarsest, but maybe 3C or something like that, the looser curls that some of us as African Americans have. But it is an interesting topic. The next few podcasts, I am going to talk about the Pan-African. I'm going to talk about Marcus Garvey, and I'm going to delve into the Pan-African movement. Like I said, Marcus Garvey himself, I think if you listen to T.I.'s Hot Messy History, which I do, and she talks about she and Ashley Says So are two of my favorites when it comes to the old school tea. And I like some old school tea because then people it's funny to me how people as they get older, get convenient amnesia. And they were never doing none of this stuff that these young people are doing nowadays. Oh, no, they weren't, but they were doing worse. Okay, they were doing worse. So to hear some of this stuff is funny because I was like, woo, y'all was cutting up. And, to hear some of the stuff that they were doing and some of the stuff that they got into, they weren't that much different. But Ty's channel deals with not just people in entertainment, but she also covers some old school tea on many of our great leaders in the black community. And as I said earlier, A lot of times, there's a reason why we have the term intersectionality. And we have the term intersectionality because not only do black women have the challenges of, ethnicity, of being black and having to deal, navigate racism, we also have to navigate sexism. And navigating sexism from the standpoint of a woman of color is, child. We just really have to deal with that. And many times the battle can be with our own men. Our own men who have been taught that the women who share their color do not qualify to be good wives. Now, there's a gentleman on YouTube, I think it's Brazil Today, who talks about the interracial dating that's done in Brazil and how it's really not about love doesn't have a color. It's really, if anything, the interracial dating is evidence of the racism that persists. Okay, so everybody that's dating interracially ain't doing it because love don't have a color. Many of them are doing it because love does have a color, and it's a lot of stuff about upping their standard, upping their way of life. I'll talk about that a little bit more in subsequent subsequent podcasts. But right now I'm going to go ahead and end this. I think an hour of each of these lessons is going to be a good thing. I don't want to wear you out. I don't want to wear out your ears. I know how I am when I listen to people on YouTube or even watch, and I'm a visual learner. I'm good for about maybe a good they have to really, really be engaging or really, really be talking about a topic that I'm really getting into for me to stay that whole hour. If it's more than an hour, even with their lives, if it's over an hour long, I'm doing good to get in there, and they have to get to that topic right away. And I don't know if I'm like that because I'm also a content creator, so I have my own channel that I'm managing and everything. But I'm going to go ahead and get off here. I will see you with the next episode. You all have a good one. It is the sound of me blowing a kiss to you, and you enjoy your day. Hello, you have reached the message line for Adam's Rib Media Ministry. If you would like to give me a shout out, recommend some topics for discussion, or give an opinion about some topics that I've already discussed, either here on my podcast or on my blogs, leave me a message and I will get right back to you. Have a blessed day. Bye-bye.